Thank you very much. I know it's probably a sensitive time to be talking about being in a sanctuary or to talk in any way about religious leaders in a public domain, but our imam and our rabbi and our minister, Dr. Clark, I think has taken us up to see from 20,000 feet the view of who and where we are now and where we need to go. And so for me, I want to say, okay, now that we're looking at the landscape that he said, I'd like us to take a particular focus on one particular part of that landscape. Now you call it, and often I call it, and we call it, special populations. And I'm amazed that we use that term, given that we are talking about a criminal justice population in this country that is second to none. The United States of America has 5% of the world's population, and we incarcerate 25% of incarcerated individuals. That's astounding. An African American child born today has a 33% chance of being under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system at some point in his life. And there are more than 3 times as many African Americans in prison cells than there are in colleges and universities. I call that an abomination in the very most biblical sense of that time. I call it an abomination because it seems to me that we can't talk about public health issues without talking about civil justice issues, and indeed without talking about civic issues. That America has to take a new look at what it is doing to its criminal justice population. And when we look at that population and how we got to this atrocious stand, what we see is because of policies that emerged in the 80s having to do with let's get tough on crime and let's incarcerate those who are addicted and committing crimes because of their addiction. The single most driving factor in incarceration rates in this country over the decades has to be because of addiction. And I want to give credence and I want to give a shout out to George de Leon, because way back in the 70s, in the 80s, George de Leon was one, and NDRI were uniquely one of the first groups to say, wait a minute, we've got to look at this population, we have to build treatment systems that address this population, and we've been living off of your good work and hopefully with you improving that work over the years. Now, we are in a new phase called reentry, and just for a moment, I want to say to you that you're going to be hearing, I hope, about a new phase called no entry. We are working with some of the people on the Hill, we're working with Faces and Voices, will be, to try and approach the concept that we can now look at legislation and public policy which stops people from being incarcerated, which talks about prevention, early intervention, alternatives to incarceration, and which indeed provides at all levels and in all points a recovery-oriented system of care. You'll be hearing about that more. Going back to the crisis, or what I call the abomination, if you look at the prevalence of people with substance abuse disorders involved in the criminal justice system, it's exponentially higher than the general population. General population around 9%, prisons 45 to 50, 3, jail 68. The case is clear. The case is clear. If we look across the nation in terms of the numbers of people just in our federal and state prisons, we're talking about 618,000 individuals. Add to that the people on parole. Add to that the people on probation. You're talking about millions and millions of individuals, the majority of whom have some level of substance abuse and potentially mental health issues. We know that 700,000 individuals will be released this year into our communities. Now, Bill White talked about community outreach. It seems to me, Bill, there's a group that ought to be pretty easy to get your hands on and to be able to deal something. We talk about a life in the community for everyone. That's what SAMHSA's motto has been. What kind of a life in the community are these 700,000 individuals going to have? That's not life in the community. In addition, what are we talking about when we're talking about the children of these people? We are perpetuating a generational disaster. Generation after generation after generation. So the whole theme that we've talked about, the importance of family care, the importance of family involvement, we have just begun to touch what that issue would be. But the point of today, outside of trying to convince you that as the congregation in this sanctuary, This is an issue. These are people. This is a problem that you must begin to wrap your hands around and think very strategically about. It's also to talk about how do we begin to develop the paradigm of a recovery-oriented systems of care in a criminal justice population. And in my mind, it's absolutely the most effective approach. If you know that you're dealing with a high-crisis individual, a high-risk individual who's gone into the justice system after having failed either in education, jobs, no jobs, mentally ill, may have been in treatment, may not have been in treatment, absolutely in crisis. So we are now talking about individuals who need and are at the very brink of total disintegration. Obviously, we're going to need to think very strategically and very carefully about all of the elements of that individual's life, what it's going to be to build that life up. And so that's an important factor. The other thing is we have to go beyond thinking about individual care to think about the system. How do we deliver to that individual all of the various components of service that and support that person needs? And that's the development of an infrastructure, the bridge. Now, I'll talk a little bit about task. Call it by any other name you want, but there really has to be an infrastructure that can deliver seamlessly those kinds of supports. Obviously, yeah, I'm not going to go through what recovery management means with it. You've heard from the top experts in the field. We're going beyond acute care. It's quite clear, and it has become particularly clear within the criminal justice system, that in the acute care model, the therapeutic community without community resources, without reentry resources, does not work. It is not the solution to the problem. So we move from episodes of acute care to just symptom stabilization to a whole new level of looking at a corrupt client-directed management of lifelong recovery. And we know that one episode of treatment, we talked about that, that's just the beginning, if at all, and we must integrate that episode of treatment or episodes into a larger system of care. We also understand, and we have come to understand in dealing with the criminal justice population, particularly in structured correctional settings, that you can do a series of things. You can even begin at the beginning. We talked about, Dr. Clark talked about the individual who just doesn't get it. You know, it's interesting. We are the link between criminal justice courts and corrections and treatment, and I can't tell you the times I've had treatment directors come up to me and say, "You've got the worst clients. They come to me and they just don't get it." And I go, "Really? Isn't that a surprise?" And you know, they're still there in some ways. They just don't get it. Well, of course they don't get it. Why the heck would they be sitting in the Department of Corrections or in Stateville or Joliet spending 10 years of their life if they got it, obviously? So what we have tried to do is talk about a pre-recovery support, getting in the beginning to orient the individual, to orienting the individual to treatment. So there's a kind of pre-treatment aspect to it. Obviously the in-treatment support services, and then most importantly, we know that what we call post-treatment, we're calling recovery-oriented treatment, however you move on that. But the concept is that it's a continuum of care that provides ongoing support, acute care, symptom abatement, employment, education, family. Now let me tell you something about this concept of employment and what's happening today. Dr. Clark spoke about the idea that everybody is equal. It's not that one part of this recovery-oriented system of care is more important. There's one modification I want to make to that. The issue that an individual, for instance, who has been put into treatment, moved through treatment, is successfully moved through the acute phase of care, and is now, let's say they've been in a therapeutic community in a prison, and is now moving into reentry, can walk out the door of Stateville one day, and then go and get a job at U.S. Steel or the next day and succeed. It's like, no. Now, one of the experiences we've had, and I will talk about it in our Sheridan model, and I'll get to there, is trying to convince people that it ain't that simple. Jeremy Travis from the Urban Institute has been very big on looking at reentry and the importance of employment. Employment has been a very big, and it is, we know it's, you've got to encourage people. There's got to be a life of productivity. But the issue that we need to express is that it's not going to happen. There is a time of stabilization for people. And we, as the caregivers, and as the case managers need to help people stabilize before we move them into a 9-to-5 job and a job which requires a whole series of disciplines which they've never had before. The challenge of creating a recovery-oriented systems of care is that it must be organized across the most broadest scale, which Dr. Clack talked about, that treatment programs, community programs, and public systems must work together. That's not easy, but it's also not that difficult. We know what it takes. We understand what it takes. What our challenge has been, and what I have observed, and I've observed it through what we do with our criminal justice population, and also what we do with ATR, is that we have noticed that the divide between the treatment community leadership and the community leadership is pretty big. And that when the dollars start rolling, there's, we're all fighting over that dollar. Well, but, the treatment community says, we should get it, that family support program, or that child care program, or that employment program. No, it's treatment. Well, no, it's not. It's all of the above. It's the ability to work together and to understand we need to move through that process. So we also believe, and I've said this before, there needs to be a mechanism, there needs to be a bridge, there needs to be an infrastructure which helps manage the system. For us in Illinois and in North Carolina, Ohio, and a few other places, but in Illinois particularly, our agency becomes the infrastructure that facilitates the mandated population moving through all the levels of care as well as the support services. And we also manage communication back to the public systems and also work as a recovery coach with individuals who are moving through that system. Now, the best model for that we've organized is the Sheridan Correctional Center. We've had 950 beds now. There are 1,100 beds to be filled. It's been in business for about 3 years. It includes a $40 million allocation, $20 million of which went into the community. And that community represents all of the services that we've talked about in a recovery-oriented systems of care. This chart, and I don't know if you can see it, looks at the latest data. I shouldn't have even put it up, but really I haven't been okayed, but I thought, what the heck. The latest outcome data, that if you look at the left side, those who are reincarcerated within 6 months having left Sheridan, the left side is those that have been through Sheridan. The right side of the first 2 bars are those who have not returned to prison. Left side, Sheridan, those who have not. And then the last is the percent employed. Now what's significant about this number is the reason these aren't good numbers is these represent the guys who started in the beginning. We set up the program too fast. We didn't have all the recovery support services in place. They are in place now, so we expect this data to get even better. So let the congregation go out and go forth and really take that large view of what we need to do, and please understand that when it comes to what is going on in the justice system and what is happening with disproportionate minority confinement and the impact of that, it really does go to the root of what we call our civil society. Thank you.